I'm Mike Gelb. I'm the community manager here at MFD. At MFD, we are an inventory success platform that helps small and medium businesses in multiple categories, whether that's construction, CPG, soft goods, hard goods, electronics, with sourcing, manufacturing, and financing their inventory. Needless to say, given how we work with companies on an operational level, these tariffs are very top of mind for us and the businesses who use our products and services. It's a pleasure to be joined here by two operations experts, our CEO Pranay and also our head of global supply Hamad. Pranay and Hamad, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey,
Hey, thanks for having us.
So let's first start on the tariffs that are present, which is a 10% increase on Chinese goods. Can you tell us more, Hamad and Pranay, a little bit about this tariff, who you think predominantly this is going to impact the most?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that and start. So let's be really clear. That 10% is not from a base of zero. That 10% is on top of what it was known as, Section 301 tariffs that were introduced during the previous Trump administration and has stayed. So this is on top of that and affects everyone that is importing from China into the United States. The key provision in here that I think impacts a lot of the D2C businesses is that the de minimis of $800 goes away. So that means anyone who is bringing in kind of drop shipping or direct-to-consumer shipments from factory or holding location in China or Hong Kong into the United States, that now under the $800 de minimis, which means they paid no duty on that, that goes away. So you will now be paying a duty on that. So that's kind of the big takeaway that I took from just that part of it.
How about you, Pranay?
so I think before we talk a little bit about the current duties, I think it's important for our audience or our SMBs or customers, whoever they are, to understand that there are two types of duties right now that have been implemented. Traditionally, the tariffs have only been implemented on bulk import goods, but the de minimis that Hamad talked about is a separate type of tariff. That's basically essentially like a loophole in the US customs, which was essentially if you were walking through duty free and you bought $800 worth of alcohol or whiskey or wine or chocolates or your perfume, you walked through the actual customs and you walked through nothing to declare and you had under $800 of personally purchased items. You didn't have to pay customs duty on that. That's the origin of the de minimis. What happened is, because it's enshrined as a de minimis thing for individuals and consumers, e-commerce companies essentially kind of Frankenstein their shipping into that. You could ship directly from China to the consumer's home, not to a business in the US, and basically charge the consumer as if they were walking through customs with that inventory from China. And so the two separate things to talk about is the 10% tariffs, which are basically on bulk imports, which have nothing to do with consumers, which are B2B. And the other is to talk about the de minimis, which is essentially e-commerce companies making it look like a consumer bought bought products straight from China and can buy up to $800 a day duty free. And so what has happened traditionally in the Trump first period, as well as Obama, as well as Biden, basically kept the tariffs going because Biden could have struck down the tariffs if he wanted to, but they found it very useful as geopolitical warfare to keep tariffs on goods that were shipped from Chinese businesses to American businesses. And as an American business imported it, they were paying for those tariffs on the cost of goods. And so what has happened is the 10% increase is on top of a 16% or an 8% or a 5% or a 10% or a 25% tariff. So your incremental amount of money you're paying is still on the cost of goods. And so that 10% tariff is not going to make much of a bump to our SMBs or to our customers or to people who are coming in, because think if you're buying $1 million of cost of goods today, your annualized tariff cost for the 10% is only $100,000, which is not a lot considering you're already paying $250,000 in duties on that $1 million. So you're adding another $100,000. But if you're selling that $1 million of goods for $4 million, it's essentially less than 2.5% of your actual revenue. So the 10% tariffs that as they affect our audience or customers, whoever they are, is a problem, but it's not the big problem. The problem with the tariffs on China, Mexico, Canada that have been implemented for the de minimis amount is saying no longer can e-commerce companies float in goods at full retail value for the consumer with no duty or tariff.
So, right, because of Section 301, that exception goes away in terms of under $800. So if you
No, that's 321. That's section
321.
321.
Yeah.
321.
301 is the list of tariffs Trump implemented in 2017 on all the B2B goods coming in. So everyone in the world, in the US, pays Section 301 as a business when they import goods. However, consumers were not paying any duty, but now with Section 321, the e-commerce companies that are shipping the goods will have to pay that duty.
So I'm thinking about who this would affect. I'd imagine, in terms of who actually would be affected by this. Drop shippers, I'd imagine, if you're drop shipping from China. Yeah. Go for it.
So I would say drop shippers definitely are impacted. So if you think of the Temus, the Shines, Pranay and I are both a bit, sneakerheads a little bit. So any sort of sneaker guys that are bringing stuff in direct to consumer, those guys get impacted. But it's more than that, right? It's if you're a DT or if you're a brand that's bringing stuff in, one thing you have to look at is, for example, is the bond that you have for clearing duties, right, with your broker. If you had a bond of, let's say, $1 million because you brought in $10 million of goods, and now the amount of duty you're going to pay goes up, you're going to have to increase your bond as well. So that's something to be aware of. I believe that there is no duty drawback on the 10% as well. So what you could get back when you bring into the United States and then export out from the U.S., you could usually draw that back and retain, get that money back, recoup it. This 10% is ineligible for that. So that's another kind of thing to be aware of. And then also, if you've got a contract with a DHL or a FedEx to bring goods in from overseas, from China or Hong Kong, and your spend band, which is how your discounts are managed on that contract, is a certain level. And now that you're not going to be able to maybe do these shipments and have that large spend anymore, that band drops, which means your discounts will drop. So that's another thing just to be aware of, is the impact to your discounts on shipping as well. So just some things to touch on, to be aware of. So
do you think in terms of, are we going to see, do you think, increase in terms of warehousing actually in the U.S. instead of doing all of the warehousing in China or in China, just thinking about the Chinese one?
I mean, I would say that, if you're warehousing today and you bring in bulk today into the U.S., you may continue to warehouse in Hong Kong because that might be cheaper than having to warehouse in the U.S. Or you can bring it stateside and have it held in bond in a free trade zone. We're in Los Angeles, so at LAX or nearby warehouses, you can hold it in bond there and then only pay that duty once it is shipped out to whoever the end consumer is for that good.
I'll add something here. I think that this is an important contextual update. De minimis exploitation or usage by e-commerce companies requires an immense scale of units. You've got to figure out how to create warehousing infrastructure overseas, labeling infrastructure overseas, sorting infrastructure overseas, repackaging infrastructure, bundling infrastructure, software to programmatically run CBP entries. air shipment from those warehouses to inject it into the US, putting it into the USPS system, and then local delivery. And you've got to do that millions of times a year. I think Timo and Shine and bigger e-commerce companies do millions of packages a month, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of packages a month, billions of packages even. That's who will be affected. Not an SMB who's doing 10,000 packages a month, because they don't have the volume or the scale or the infrastructure to actually work on a 321. An SMB who's basically buying $100,000 worth of goods or $1 million of goods at a time, and even $1 million a month from China, to bring it by boat or by air to a US port, clear it, deliver it to a 3PL. The 3PL repackages it and ships it. It's the traditional way of doing it. Is not affected by this. The only companies that are affected are the people who are trying to ship direct to consumer by essentially taking the amount of duty they would pay, the amount of tariff they would pay on that $800 value. Because remember that $800 is the retail value to the consumer. Their cost of goods is more like $200. So on that $200, they would pay duties, they would pay tariff, they would pay shipping, they would pay storage. They take that value and then they figure out how much they can pay to just ship that $200 worth of inventory for $800 declared value, duty free, and then a percentage of whatever they were supposed to pay on the $200, say $40, $50, whatever that is. They will pay to for service providers to do the transportation, do the packaging, do the labeling, do the shipping, do all of that stuff. And those service providers who built an entire ecosystem around this 321, there's people in Mexico who've done it, in TJ, people in Canada who've done it, people in China who've done it. I know a few startups who raise huge seed rounds based on just that technology. Those guys want volume. Because if you're paying them $10 a shipment or $5 a shipment, because the average value of these orders is $100. It's not $800. The average value of these orders you're shipping is between $100 and $200. Sometimes it's even $50. When the value of those orders is $100 or $200, and you're talking about a 25% duty and tariff cost, you're looking at a $25 to $30 barrel. These service providers are basically an arbitrage on that. So it's like $10, $12, $15 a package. That $10, $12, $15 a package, if you're not doing a million packages, it's not worth their time or their money to do it. So those service providers will get affected and those e-commerce companies will get affected. And there's hacks and caveats, and those big guys with lots of money, with tens of millions of dollars in actual savings or money or whatever it is, can always figure out how to read out those packages, ship them in bulk air, bring them in, and then finish the last mile, and just pay the cost of goods on the production cost. So there's ways to go around it. Your SMB, your average SMB, is not affected by the de minimis at all because he never had that choice.
Got it. Yeah, that's really helpful. I don't know, Hamad, if you have anything to add as well on that.
No, he's absolutely right. I mean, we're talking about, kind of two separate sets of businesses, right? These DTCs, which are impacted by it, but SMBs and larger business, SMBs are not as impacted or even close because we're just talking about 10%, right?
10% on the COGS too, not on the actual retail value of their products as well. Well, I mean, 10% of the COGS still is 10% of the COGS. I know that maybe is much more minimal, but in terms of industries that you think have maybe margin profiles that are a lot more tight, are there specific industries that actually could be impacted from this?
Furniture won't be affected by it.
Furniture.
Clothing will be affected. Any kind of soft goods, any kind of electronic consumables, those will be affected. I think drop shipping will be massively, RIP drop shipping.
Yeah, I think on the drop shipping, if you don't have a seller base locally that can step in, then Pranay is 100% right.
Got it. So, I mean, really kind of back to drop shipping under $800 value that you're actually shipping in terms of who is actually predominantly affected by this. So, I mean, with this coming in, then it's your belief that for SMBs that do source or manufacture their products in China, that they're not going to be probably changing their supply chains out from based off of this new tariff.
Let's put it this way. If the cost of changing a vendor, which is about 90 days of production value, if you were going to make a profit margin, so let's say you're buying $1 million a year. I'm going to use that round number. 25% of that, which is 3 months, is $250,000 in cost of goods. If you're going to sell that $250,000 of cost of goods for, say, $500,000, and you were essentially looking at 6 months, let's say $500,000 of cost of goods you're going to sell for $1 million. On that $500,000, which is 6 months of COGS, you were to pay an additional 10%. That's $50,000 you want to pay on that $500,000. If the cost of switching to a vendor that's outside tariff, now you have to basically calculate all the tariffs because you're not just taking the last 10%, you're taking 25 plus 10. So say 35% tariffs on $500,000. Just at the highest level, still $175,000. If you can't make that $175,000 from the new vendor in 6 months, because you don't see the new vendor actually ramping up to the quality control you want, to the production you want, to the cadence you want, to the value you want, and the pricing you want, don't switch.
Yeah, no.
But Pranay, are you referring to like a short-term, mid-term strategy? But long-term, wouldn't you agree that it's just kind of good practice to have a wide breadth of options as much as possible, like a plan B or plan C, and say, hey, if I get it made in China today, maybe next year we look at, starting something up in a different part of East or Southeast Asia, just as kind of a better, because these policies are so kind of volatile, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
He's already talked about putting tariffs on India, by the way. He calls Narendra Modi his best friend, but he want to put tariffs on it. So my point to you is, if you split your $1 million between 3 vendors or 2 vendors, let's say you have to do a transition, right? So the first year you do half and half because you want to be safe. The second year you're thinking 100% to India. But then suddenly some volatile tariff comes in, so you're like, I'm just going to keep my Chinese vendor in my back pocket. Yeah. Suddenly, that $1 million of business that was this big block that the Chinese vendor was so attracted to is no longer attractive to either of those vendors. Because you have $500,000 from one place and $500,000 from another place, and now your price has gone up, and they're like, I don't care about you as much. And the bigger problem is you don't get the same payment terms, and now those 2 vendors are basically going to have to take on other customers, and they might get a bigger customer and might squeeze you out, and your quality might go down. And you have to mix product from 2 different countries without the benchmarking and the standardization, and your customers will bitch.
Yeah, no, that's a fair thing. If you have 2 factories, just like you said, Mike, like you will not always have the exact same thing that you are selling to your consumer. You will have different levels of quality, even color, like slight color differences in things too. So definitely a risk.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
If you're not making the money back on the value that you created from the Chinese vendor with another vendor over 6 months, that's when switching doesn't make sense. If you are making the money back and it's saving, then it's great. Because see, the other problem is the moment you cross $10 million in COGS in your buying capacity, your options open up like crazy.
Yeah.
But if you're in a $5 to $10 million buying range of cost of goods, first of all, disruption to your supply chain will probably kill your company. Second of all, changing suppliers will essentially, any supplier takes 6 to 9 months to become great. You cannot get a supplier who gets great at the first shot. You've got to give them 2 or 3 tries, and then they even out into the right quality. But the third problem is that if you don't have the ability, you could figure out nearshore options, offshore options, third-party options, different countries. You're not going to be able to ever insulate yourself from geopolitical shocks. Mm-hmm. All you're doing is just making yourself more robust to protect your company.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you've said previously, Pranay, on a webinar that really stuck out to me too, when it comes to, because I know that a lot of kind of companies come to you and say, hey, our supply chain is all in China, we want to move out of China. And you say, that's great. Okay, like that's. But just to let you know, there's gonna be 30% increase in costs when it comes to moving out of China, and then they usually back away and say, "Oh, never mind, we're gonna stay put in China." So when I sorry,
It's not Mike. So it's not even so it's that, but it's also because I've gone down this idea, this rat hole. Your sub supply chain may still be coming from China. Just because you move your final,
yeah, that's a fair point.
manufacturing to country X, they may not have all the raw natural resources needed. They all may come from still the same parts of the world that you have to pull them from. So not as easy as as we say it is.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I'm also wondering if there will be a point where if you think about if you actually start splitting up your supply chain with different countries, I know like Hamad, we were talking about nearshoring, for example, and how using, for example, a Vietnam or Southeast Asia company where you're sourcing the raw materials from China, let's say, and then you're also manufacturing to a Vietnam or another one. Do you sense that this is going to have any impact when it comes to when it comes to nearshoring or even splitting up your supply chain across different countries, or not so much?
I mean, if you're already in that process and in that mindset, you probably continue to do that.
Yeah.
But as in terms of an effect based on what we're seeing, I think we're talking about week one, right? Like there's, I think to Pranay's point earlier, this is really impacting one kind of business, right? But if you're an SMB or if you're a big manufacturer, if you bring in furniture in bulk and all of that, this is having less impact. And so you probably are going to continue down that same supply chain and not make a whole bunch of changes. I think the reason this has become a big talking point is because, there are close to, I believe, over 1 billion shipments in 2024 that were under de minimis. And so that's causing the panic more than anything. But for SMBs and larger mid-sized businesses, this is, not as big of an impact, I would say. And if you can't absorb the 10%, then back when the first Trump administration put in the Section 301, what did everyone do then? Most people simply increased the price a bit to make up for the margin impact that those tariffs were having. And that may just be the case here. I don't know that it's going to shift people's factories to the United States. I just don't see that happening in mass.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a really good
So
point.
I have a nuanced take on this. I think that some industries are ripe for moving back to the US, and some industries are not. I also think that there are certain high-value products that can be produced in the US without any margin impact, and some cannot. And there are some high-value activities that can be done in the US, and some cannot. So let's just start at the base layer. Materials, mining, sourcing, all of that stuff, that's just going to keep continuing regardless of geography. You can do mining in the US, you can do energy in the US, you can do it in multiple countries. That's not going to change. Conversion from raw materials to intermediaries, that has moved overseas forever. That's never coming back to the US. You cannot take silicon and turn it into a chip or a PCB at scale in the US. I mean, I might be wrong, but I'm not talking about high tech stuff or defense stuff. I'm talking about just everyday consumer stuff. You can't take, you could probably do food processing in the US because the more mechanized and the more automated it is, the less you can turn probably cotton into yarn in the US. But you can't probably even turn yarn into fabric in the US. But you can't turn fabric into garments in the US affordably and scalably. There are a few exceptions to that. There's a couple of factories in California that actually do that at a high quality level because they've mechanized and automated 80-85% of the product. And they're only sewing joints. So they're making squares and sewing the seams because they have not found a machine that can sew like a human can. But there's a lot of items that have moved overseas, or a lot of activities that have moved overseas. and the rest is essentially can be done in the US. And so food manufacturing, chemical manufacturing, electronic assembly, electronics assembly, I think construction assemblies, light manufacturing. That can come back to the US because you can build systems to automate it with very few humans. And I think that is where you can capture a lot of value by buying cheap materials overseas that don't move the needle at the actual cost of goods level, even if they have a tariff towards them. If your component costs 20 cents out of the dollar that you're supposed to make, and your labor cost is 30 cents out of the dollar you're going to make, paying duties and tariffs just on that 20 cents only moves the needle on your cost of goods by like 2% or 3%. And moving it back into the US, and instead of paying a tariff on $100, if you pay just the tariff on the $20 and you can automate the US manufacturing and you have that ability to do that volume, and there's a lot of technology that's coming in, there's a lot of startups that's coming in. I'm an investor in one company that's doing it for machined aluminum accessories. They're actually replacing machined aluminum accessories with 3D printed carbon fiber. And they're better than aluminum. And so the casting and forging industry that basically does machined aluminum parts no longer needs to use aluminum, they can use carbon fiber. And it's cheaper and better, and even lighter. And like you can basically work with top quality manufacturing companies or materials companies. The same thing we're seeing with solvents, same thing we're seeing with chemicals, same thing you're going to see with food, same thing you see with pharmaceuticals, same thing you'll see with PCBs and firmware. I could build dumb hardware, commodity hardware anywhere in the world, test it, flash it, and bring it in, flash the PCB here and turn it into a finished product with 3D printed plastic shells that can automatically put together. And the US could essentially own that supply chain. That you don't have to go overseas, but you can do them in small batches of thousands at a time, 10,000 at a time, without losing significant margin. Those are the places you can actually onshore and nearshore product in a practical way that allows you to get people to buy the product without you having to sell made in USA for 35% more.
It's really interesting. Those different categories and also opportunities for the U.S. I'm just reading some of the comments here as well.
I see one here that if I can just make a comment.
Yeah.
So I see one from Tim. Tim, thanks for the comment. The first Trump tariffs were 7.5% to 25%. Now the next 10% makes it as high as 35%. Now the needle has really moved. If you look at it across, and again, the Trump tariff began over, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. But that world has been reset to Section 301. Everyone has followed, because when that first happened, it was a shock then. And then there was always this wait and see, like, is this going to be permanent? Is this going to be temporary? And to what Pranay said earlier, this ended up being a permanent thing, and no administration after Biden did not change it. He kept it. And so people got used to it, and it became a permanent thing. So now you have to think of this 10% as just 10%. And it's like, okay, I wouldn't think of it as 35, because if you hadn't adjusted your prices from way back then to now, then yeah, but I doubt that there are very many of those people in that position. They are at a new base, and now the new base has 10%, and then I would deal with it from that point.
Yeah, that's a great point. In terms of the market, there's now been like a few years since the first tariff happened, and the market has adjusted, and that was a much more big, that was a much bigger cliff to kind of climb.
Yeah.
And so I'd imagine prices then were also adjusted based off of those tariffs.
Yeah, and that was
we've had an unprecedented spike in inflation since 2018 when these tariffs kicked in. And a bunch of that inflation has actually raised prices. If you look at the price ranging index from 2018 till now, prices have gone up close to almost 50 to 70% across the board. If you look at any food index, you look at the CPG index, you look at every single type of price, prices of any commodity or any product have essentially gone up anywhere between 30 to 70%. If you look at t-shirts, you look at clothing, you look at accessories, you look at cell phones, you look at any product that's gone up. From 2018 to 22 for the same product, it's probably increased 30 to 70% in value, in price. And so now, if you're looking at the 10% increase in the tariff, hopefully Trump brings down interest rates soon. That'll allow you to ameliorate that a little bit. But if you essentially think about it, his goal is to essentially make trade tariffs pay for what income tax used to pay for.
Got it. Got it. No, that's really, really helpful. I think this has been tremendous, and also really helpful. Any other questions for? I know we have like a number of comments here that's been really helpful. Do we have any audience questions as well? We have a few minutes. We're going to be doing this, by the way, I think bi-weekly on a bi-weekly cadence, just because there's going to be a lot more information kind of coming out, and as well as we'll also see what happens with Canada and Mexico, and see if actually those come to fruition. But if you have questions here, we're happy to respond to them and kind of share a point of view.
We're going to have to do truth in there every time he announces tariffs. We should do a spot check and be like, hey, he announced these tariffs. Is it a real tariff or is it a fake tariff? Not fake as in like, is it a political tariff or a business tariff?
No.
China's business tariff. De minimis is business tariff. But I think that US and Mexico, Canada and Mexico are political tariffs. Because they don't have a rhyme and reason.
Yeah.
The other part of this is also that you're going to start seeing a lot more friends of USA develop. El Salvador is a great example. I will help you. In exchange, I get preferential tariff access to your business, to your country. El Salvador may become a place where you can do low-cost manufacturing, finishing with international tariffs, and be awarded tariff-free movement. You're going to see more of that in Guatemala. You're going to see more of that with Central America. You're probably going to see more of that in different countries where Trump will start saying, if you want to be my friend, you got to take all my illegals, you got to do all the stuff for me, but I'll let you have tariff-free access to our country if you're manufacturing goods in your country. And you will basically create a new kind of NAFTA free trade kind of ecosystem, which is what I think they can do, because they're going to realize in 3 years they cannot pull all the manufacturing back to the US. And they're going to realize that the business people who supported Trump need a way to actually get tariff-free access back to the US, whether it's construction materials, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, accessories, whatever it is. And this is how he's going to loophole it.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I appreciate that in terms of what countries maybe stand to gain the most. Not maybe so much from the China tariff, but more so from potential Canada and the Mexico tariffs, because if those were to come to fruition, 25%, that is massive. So that's also a really good point. We have a question here from Steven. Do you think the importers will absorb the prices, the retailer, or the consumer?
I mean,
So start with the importer.
Yeah.
And then a portion will be probably passed through to the retailer, but you can't, if you don't have pricing power with the retailer, it's hard. But you could raise the MSRP. See, importers and retailers actually have power on the retail side where a consumer can choose to buy or not to buy. And the bigger problem you're going to see is if there's a recession coming where they don't drop the interest rate soon or basically stimulate spending in the market, it'll be a double whammy, because the tariff will increase your input costs and the recession will essentially lower spending. And so you won't be able to actually pass through the cost, so the people in the middle will actually get squeezed.
Yeah. This other question just came in. Do you think people are going to use tariffs as a profit center? I think people use shipping as a profit center because it's usually it has a veil across it. But with tariffs, it's usually, everyone can research what a tariff rate is for the good that you're purchasing. And so you can call out, that particular company on potentially, you using it as a profit center. So I don't think that would happen, but I don't know, Pranay, if you've seen it the other way.
Let me ask you a question. What do you charge a tariff on? Ex-works price or DDP price?
So if they don't know that, then I guess that's...
So if you're basically paying a tariff on the ex-works price, because when you declare your custom 7501 in US CBP, the US CBP allows you to pay tariffs and duties just on the ex works price. If you split out what your freight, your shipping, your packet, your duty, and your storage is. However, if you essentially take the tariff value and the duties value on the shipping and the freight price, which can be up to 25-30% of the value, you've suddenly got a 5% additional or 7% additional value that you can essentially keep.
You could, yeah.
Because when you declare one price on a 7501, that 7501 essentially is basically what they calculate the duty and tariff on. But if you break it down with X works price, that's what they calculate the duty on.
Yeah.
And people make this mistake all the time, or people don't make this mistake and just pass it through saying, I'm calculating duties on a DDP price to a retailer, but they're actually calculating it on the X works price.
Yeah. Yeah, fair.
Yeah, that's fair. And of course, someone could kind of hack that too. It makes a ton of sense. Well, this has been great. Pranay, Hamad, thank you both so much for your time. We're going to try to make these, I think, around 30 minutes each time, just because we know how it is when it comes to attending things that are virtual, and I'm sure that people are kind of on Zoom calls a lot of the time anyway. But hopefully this was informative. I think as a recap, we think that in terms of this tariff specifically on the 10% on China, it's not going to so much impact SMBs. It's really going to be focusing. It's really going to impact drop shippers or people that are actually making purchasing products directly through China or are fulfilling through China and not so much actually buying in bulk.
I mean, watch out for the Shopify bros that are doing drop shipping all day. Like, this is going to impact them, I'm sure, pretty hard.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I wonder, actually, I'm just kind of curious in terms of how, I wonder what the percentages for Shopify fees actually come from kind of drop shippers or
I
folks.
don't know.
I don't know. Could be interesting.
Awesome.
Shopify makes a lot of its money on payment processing, not on the actual fees itself.
Not on the actual monthly subscriptions?
No. The monthly subscriptions are less than 20% of the revenue now. 30% of the revenue now.
Okay. That's also good to know.
But they're still valued as a SaaS company.
It's wild, even though it's not from that standpoint in terms of for every single transaction. Pranay and Hamad, thank you both so much for your time. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.